You don't fool me. I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you could be Robin. Well, you can't.
Outside of Hush and Death of Superman, I haven't seen any of the movies that are tied into this continuity. Half so because of the animation style, because to me it just kind of looks like anime light, and being that I'm not an avid anime fan, it just never seemed all that appealing to me. And the other half of that, because, well, as a lot of you may know, I hate Damian Wayne. I hate his characterization, I hate his character, I hate the relationship that created his character. I do not like this fictional child. If you need me to further elaborate, I've actually made a whole video on this very topic, so feel free to check it out. But all of that changes today, because for the first time ever, I watched Son of Batman. So let's get into it. What is this movie? The League of Assassins is ambushed by one of its own, as Slade Wilson, better known to many as Deathstroke, takes his revenge for not being included in the will. Slade is angered at the fact that Batman's bastard love child will inherit the League over him. Despite his years of hard work and very impressive resume, the guy just can't compete with nepotism. Knowing that his time is up, he decides so is his master's, and takes the life of Ra's al Ghul, killing him so good that even a Lazarus Pit bath can't bring him back. This leads to Talia taking her son to Gotham City to meet his father, the pointed-eared night rat. And when Talia and Bruce reconnect, they reminisce over the time Talia literally, how do I say this without YouTube straight up taking away my potential earnings here? They reminisce over the time Talia rape-daped him. Like, I'm not exaggerating. She straight up says,
"Would you like a drink?"
Last time that didn't go so well.
Oh, you're right. If I remember correctly, I put a little something in your beverage.
Ha! So you admit it, she admits it.
And listen, if anybody wants to come to the comment section and talk to me about power dynamics here, shut up. This is still problematic any way you spin it. I mean, I know that she's a villain, but like, I feel like there should be limits to this kind of thing. There's bad, and then there's just distasteful evil. And this is certainly that. And may I just ask, and I've always meant to ask this, but are we really sure this is Batman's kid? I mean, he looks like the spitting image of Batman's adopted son. Are we sure that Talia didn't slip any of the fully grown boy wonders or too? She's clearly not above doing something like that. Talia drops the kid off and dips. And Batman accepts this. But like, hold on. She admittedly dapes the guy. And then she left him with his unwanted love child, and now it's his responsibility? I mean, that's just kind of unacceptable, ain't it? If I was him, I would ask the kid how old he was before immediately Googling the latest one could get an abortion. I'm just saying, it's worth a look. Like, let's think about this, Bruce. Who really even knows that this kid exists? He probably isn't documented. You could just leave him anywhere. And no one's gonna judge you, let alone me. Especially not me. I understand. I just wouldn't suggest dropping him off with anyone because more than likely they would look to return him. Now I'll be real with you. Up until this point in the movie, I hated everything I saw. As a matter of fact, I was already pre-typing up my closing paragraph about why this movie is terrible. Like, I genuinely dislike the vast majority of it, for reasons I will get to after the synopsis. But the interaction between Bruce and Damian is the first thing of quality that this movie offered up that I enjoyed. It's interesting watching these two try to begrudgingly form a bond, because neither is really sure how to play the role that Talia has dealt them. Damian, for all that he's learned from the League, doesn't know how to be a child, let alone the son of Batman. And Batman has no idea how to be a parent, despite technically already kind of having been one. Look, when you take into account that Bruce has raised two orphans and acted like a close uncle to a third boy wonder prior to Damian's arrival, I think this narrative starts to fall apart a little bit. But logic be damned, their banter does actually endear me to these two characters and these two performances, which I'm not really a fan of either, actually, so we'll talk about that later. The father and son think that they're worlds apart, and in some ways, they are. But Damian is still very clearly his father's son. The two have a lot in common, and they act a lot alike. Both have to be stoic and in control. The dynamic between this duo is so perfect because their clashes come from the contrasts of the characters, but also from the comparisons there are to be made between them too. They argue because they're both thick-headed, stubborn, and feel that they always know what's best. But they also butt heads because they have completely different philosophies and ways to go about things. I especially like the scenes in which Batman is teaching Damian the importance of compassion. The two silently bond during these teaching moments. And what I kinda like about this pairing is that it's completely different from Batman's relationship with the previous Robins. With Dick, Jason, and Tim, Batman offered them training, taught them how to fight, taught them how to overcome victimhood and become a survivor, and furthermore, become a hero. But for the most part, Damian's already got his training, trained by the same league since birth that trained his father. Batman's not teaching Damian how to fight, he's teaching Damian how to live. His training of Damian is not how to be a hero, but how to first be a human. How to live life outside the costume, and how important it is to have a life outside of that costume. The further away he is from people socially, the more alien he is. If he wants to save people, he must live amongst those people. He must learn the significance of human life. If he wants to heal others, he's got to stop hurting them. I actually surprisingly really like this. Wait, did I just compliment Damian Wayne? Oh jeez, what have I become? Anyway, elsewhere, Deathstroke and his League of Unextraordinary Gentlemen kidnap Dr. Langstrom and his family, as the pre-Bat man was previously affiliated and working with the original League. Slade takes over the project and forces Langstrom to do his bidding, as he wants an army of Man-Bat assassins. Because really, isn't that the American dream? Shortly thereafter, he also kidnaps Talia with ease, and I'm gonna pause it right here, because this is one of the things that frustrates me the most about this movie. It feels it has to discredit characters in order to build other characters up. Talia is captured with absolute ease, hardly putting up any fight and being taken by her captors in a matter of moments. This should never happen. Talia, much like her son, has been trained since birth on how to properly defend herself. She was literally born into a League of Assassins. Like what? I get that Slade needed to take her hostage for the plot to progress, but the way they went about it makes her look weak. And ultimately, this turns what is probably the most highly skilled woman in Batman's rogues gallery into a complete damsel in distress. This is a pretty awful development. And it's not the only time something like this happens either, as I would even say Raze's death in the opening was also very poorly handled. But hell, at least that guy got the chance to fight back. And to a lesser extent, Damian getting past Batman's security system so easily, and doing so without the world's greatest detective being able to spot him prior to finding him in Wayne Enterprises, is just kind of bullshit. Like, I get why all of this is done. You need to prove the abilities of one character by having them get one over on another established, seemingly greater character to truly showcase their abilities. But there are better ways of doing these things. I just think that everything comes too easy to too many characters. Damian tracks down the once thought to be loyal servant of Ra's al Ghul, Ubu, and when the big guy who betrayed his grandfather won't talk, Damian decides instead he'll die. And as he's about to take his life, at last second, who comes in to save the day? But Nightwing. Which, by the way, Nightwing here, looking a lot like his Young Justice counterpart these days. Not complaining, just commenting. Batman's oldest and youngest go head-to-head, with the older brother getting the best of his sort of sibling. And after the ass-whooping he hands out to the kid, he decides to drop some truth bombs too.
I know what you're thinking. You're thinking you could be Robin. Well, you can't.
You're damn right he can't, Nightwing! Look, I'm gonna be honest with you. I hate Damian as a character, but his dynamics and interactions with other characters is starting to wear on my hatred. I can't stand this little punk on his own, but given the right character to interact with, it really lessens my hatred. It almost endears me to the character. Damian and Nightwing genuinely act like bickering brothers from the moment that they meet. I enjoy this. I love this relationship. Wait, did I just say two good things about Damian Wayne? Oh god. Oh man, I don't know who I am anymore. What I enjoy far less is that directly after Damian almost kills a man, and then attempts to kill his older brother, he's punished by becoming Robin. I know the reasoning behind this in the story was that Batman needed to keep Damian close, but this lapse in logic feels really forced and really dumb. It makes Batman look like a fool for allowing him to take up the mantle, when within that same scene, Batman just scolded the boy and told him that he's no better than a criminal. But yeah, alright, let him be Robin because the story demands it, I guess. That makes sense. Damian proceeds to prove that this was a mistake almost immediately, as he acts completely recklessly, and lands himself and his father into a whole heap of trouble. forcing this new team to take on the likes of League Ninjas and genetically altered Man-Bats. The team takes in Langstrom, no thanks to Damien who was attempting to kill him, and have him work on developing a cure. The Bat family rescues Langstrom's Man family, but when they rescue the two, Langstrom's daughter delivers a message to Robin from Deathstroke. Deathstroke lures Damien to his hideout by promising to kill his mother should he not get there within a set amount of time. Something Damien of course keeps hidden from his father. But when the two do come face to face, Deathstroke winds up killing Talia, who jumps in the way of a bullet meant for her son. Aww, look at that. The Predator did have a heart. Aww. The Man-Bats are taken out with antidotes. Batman arrives just in the nick of time to save Talia using the power of the Lazarus Pit, as Damien and Deathstroke have a very violent, and I mean very violent, final battle. Both are stabbed, blood is shed. Honestly, it's a pretty impressive sequence, and I don't think my words can do it justice. Ultimately, Damien defeats Deathstroke, but refuses to kill him, holding to his father's teachings as opposed to his grandfather's teachings. Talia is saved, and her and Batman embrace, which, given the context, is kinda gross. Seriously, I hate this pairing. It is not great. Thank God we got to see that passionate consensual kiss between a man and his... What a wonderful love story. The place collapses and Talia goes her separate way to reform her father's league, while Damien decides to stay behind and learn under his father's wing. Talia relents, promising to return for her son someday. And that is Son of Batman. The movie is well animated, but like I said in my intro, the style just doesn't appeal to me. That's not to say it's bad, but just to say it's not really my taste. Not only does the style not really suit me, it doesn't seem like it suits the story that it's telling. Compare this to Batman Ninja, where the art style is very clearly, undoubtedly anime-inspired. It works there because the art complements the story that it's telling. It was an anime-inspired Batman story that utilized plenty of concepts and tropes anime fans were more than familiar with. The animation had a purpose. And I would even argue that the artwork in that movie added to the final product and made it that much better. But here, the style really serves no particular purpose. It's just a strange aesthetic choice that was made for this animated movie universe with no rhyme or reason. I do really like some of the visuals though. Not the character models or anything, but just like the basic imagery. Seeing Croc chained up in Arkham trying to snap at Batman while he stands an inch away from his reach, completely unfazed, was great. That is totally something I'd expect to see from The Dark Knight. I love that. But overall, visually, it's not really that appealing for me. And audibly, it's also not really that appealing for me. Here's the thing about this movie. It has a fantastic voice cast. The problem is that they're all fantastically miscast. For the most part, I kinda hate the voice acting in this. These just aren't the voices I'd expect to hear coming from these character models, and more so over these characters. Marina Baccarin, who I've loved in just about everything I've seen her in. Like, I mean, seriously, she's great. From Gotham, to Deadpool, to the original unaired It's Always Sunny pilot, she's always great. Or so I thought. Look, if I'm being honest, she's not bad here at all. But I guess I just expect a little bit more out of her as Talia. She ultimately just doesn't leave a strong impression. Far from the worst performance in the movie, but far from her best performance overall. I think it's serviceable, but a little bit forgettable. And as for Ra's al Ghul, wait, Giancarlo was Rage? Oh, gee. Man, I want to be out here singing your praises, but this is 2 times in the same month that you've let me down in an animated DC movie. You better fucking kill it as Professor X, or otherwise, quite frankly, I'm gonna start questioning my love for you. I don't all the way hate this one, but it does just feel like someone trying to sound vaguely like a Ra's al Ghul type. And half the time, for the short time that he's on screen, I will say that he succeeds. The other half of the time, Jason Mara isn't offensively bad as Batman, but he is offensively boring as Batman. It's just not the voice I want to hear out of The Dark Knight. I mean, in terms of delivery, I think he's mostly fine. I don't think he plays the part poorly, but it's the voice itself that just doesn't gel with me. Just not what I've come to expect from a Batman performance personally. I got more used to it throughout the runtime, but that doesn't mean it was making anybody's top 10 list anytime soon. I really hate Damian Wayne's voice actor. So I guess what I'm saying is that he's spot on. It was good. I don't know. I'm not going to be too hard on this performance because much like the character, the actor was only a child at the time, and child actors aren't always exactly stellar. I mean, how many good kid actors can you think of? You got Shirley Temple, the kids from Stranger Things, and Macaulay Culkin. That's it. That's all of them. Every other snot-nosed brat put in front of a camera acted like they were in a third-grade play for My Fair Lady. Actually, if I'm being honest, it really does depend on the line. The performance does get good, but it isn't always. Especially in the first couple scenes with him, it just didn't work for me. But it did get better over time. There are certain lines here and there that aren't just said, they're felt. But I'm also not going to act like it was entirely consistent throughout. But let me talk about the worst offender here, Thomas Gibson, who's probably most famous for the incredible work he did in Criminal Minds, and who I originally first appreciated in Dharma and Greg. And yes, that is a show I watched when I was growing up, what of it? But here, Thomas Gibson is downright awful as Slade. He never once comes across as authentic. He just sounds like someone who's trying really hard and failing even harder. Out of everyone, I would probably say he's the most out of place. Because if I'm judging this as a Deathstroke performance, it greatly misses the mark. Gibson just can't emulate the casual, careless confidence the Swordman has. I think the best Slade Wilson portrayals make the character effortless in his bid to intimidate his foes. He's a master in all that he does, and because of this, he's audibly calm-sounding at all times. I'm not saying the man doesn't emote, but I'm saying the man doesn't wildly emote like he does in this movie. I mean, here, Slade is practically yelling at the top of his lungs and speaking in his over-the-top voice. The guy is just a ham and cheese sandwich in this one. Somehow, despite not having any physical presence, Gibson manages to chew the animated scenery around him. Was his only frame of reference for a Batman villain the 1960s show? Because if so, I would say that almost makes sense. So as Slade Wilson, no, this is definitely not a good performance. But if I was taking my knowledge and love for the character out of the equation entirely, then this is still a really bad performance. I'm sorry, Tommy, I know you can do better. I've seen it. I've witnessed it. This just isn't it for you. I can't tell if this was the wrong role for the guy, or he just needed to be in front of a camera rather than behind a microphone, but either way, this sucked. And it's not just the characters' voices that I take issue with, it's the acting itself. The dialogue feels mostly unnatural and sometimes stilted. The way lines are delivered feels so mechanical. Like the cast had one take to get things right, and the studio was secretly recording them when they were reading over the lines for the first time. Like, did they even know that they were being recorded and what they were saying was going into the final cut? Or did just nobody care? I will say, I think the exception to this for me is Nightwing and Alfred, which I thought in both instances the characters were almost completely out of place because of how good they were. So would I recommend Son of Batman? Well, yeah. Yeah, surprisingly, I think I would. Despite me not liking the animation style or some of the vocal performances from time to time, I think the dynamics within the movie, as well as the lessons learned from characters, really did a lot to endear me to the overall final product. Ultimately, I would say this movie is kind of a mixed bag. I mean, going into this, I hated it. I absolutely hated it. For the first 15 to 20 minutes, I loathed my experience. But past that, I started finding a lot of redeeming qualities. And by the end of it, I kind of feel like it broke even. I didn't hate this movie nearly as much as I thought I would, but I didn't love it as much as a lot of you guys said I would. There are parts of it I absolutely hate, but there are also parts of it I found myself really enjoying. I would not at all mind rewatching it, because I, for the most part, liked it. Didn't hate it, didn't love it, but I liked it. But the real question here is, do I still hate Damian Wayne? The answer? Yes, but with a little asterisk there. I don't like the concept of the character. I don't like the notion that Batman has to have his biological son become a sidekick and then eventually take the mantle from it. I think that there are far better characters to do so, and I will talk more about that in an upcoming video. I don't like the background of how such a character was conceived. I don't like the character, except when I do. Damian isn't really an interesting character to me, until you juxtaposed him with some of the other primary characters in the continuity. The developing dynamics between him and Bruce and him and Nightwing really have simmered down my overall hatred for this guy. And I think maybe, emphasis on maybe, I could eventually come around to not entirely loathing his existence. Maybe. Although, however, I am still very upset that the general public decided to take this boy in and love him for the same reasons that they hated my favorite Robin, Jason Todd. But okay. Alright, I understand. It's fine. That's just my own thing. Yes, I would absolutely recommend Son of Batman. I would warn you that the first 20 minutes are kind of a bat bomb, but past that, it's a bat, something good. Look, I can't always be clever. Actually, I can never be clever, but here we are. So if you haven't already, check out Son of Batman.
My grandfather taught me everything I need to know about personal combat.
Well, I was trained by Bruce Wayne, and every time they met, he kicked Ra's al Ghul's ass.
I'm once again checking out another Batman movie that I've yet to see. I've explained why in my Son of Batman video that I didn't watch this movie before, and if you haven't watched that video yet, I highly suggest checking it out before you watch this one. But the gist of it is blah blah blah, anime looking Batman, I don't like anime, blah blah blah, I hate Damian Wayne, which is also another video that I made, and I suggest checking that out as well. But never mind that shit. Here comes Batman vs. Robin. And let me say right off the bat, no pun intended, man, I've really missed out on not checking this out sooner. This movie's opening is some of the darkest content I've ever seen in a Batman movie. Animation or live action. Like, this gives Batman Returns a run for its money. The bizarre doll maker, a giant ogre of a man, who dresses up in what looks to be stretched out children's clothing, and then hides his face behind a doll mask. Just based on appearance alone, this is deeply, deeply unsettling. And probably the scariest Batman villain I have ever seen in my life. But then add to it that the character is abducting children and replacing their body parts with weapons, turning them into his doll army, and that's just a heaping truckload of nightmare fuel that I did not ask for. It's welcome, but I just want to go on record and say I did not sign up for this. I did not put in my order, this is not something that I would have ever asked for. The character's also voiced by Weird Al Yankovic, who's really putting his heart, soul, and vocal cords into making this already deeply unnerving man that much more unsettling. The character looks nothing like the incarnations I've seen of the character previously, but then again, there was about a good 8 years of Batman comics that I stayed away from, so if anybody wants to correct me in the comments, you're more than welcome to. But as far as I'm concerned, this looks nothing like any incarnation I've ever seen of the character, though that's not a complaint, so much as it is a comment. Because yeah, this is a horrifying upgrade. I don't expect to see this guy in a Batman movie, I expect to see him in the next Twisted Metal game. My one regret about this is that this character very clearly could carry a movie of his own. I could and seeing him dismantled with ease by having his heart ripped out of his chest was a shocking way to start this movie. Suffice it to say, this ain't your grandpa's Batman. Hell, this ain't even your daddy's Batman either. This is a very shocking and dark interpretation of the character and the world that surrounds him. And because of that fact, instantaneously, I was smitten with this movie. I think the film does a really good job of establishing its leads, showcasing both Batman and Robin's particular abilities. And it does speak to the growth of Damian Wayne, as we actively see him attempt to put his vengeance aside in the name of justice. But he doesn't do so because of his own beliefs, he does so out of respect for his father's teachings. We also early on see that Robin isn't just some bloodlusting barbarian. Like his father before him, he's also quite the detective, managing to pick up clues on a case that his father had either overlooked or just frankly hadn't looked at yet. The one negative I will say is that the movie has a lot of Bruce getting his ass handed to him in order to progress the plot. And I get why this happens in the story, but it does make Batman look like he's lacking in the hero department, or at the very least, getting a little bit ineffective due to age. The banter between Batman and Robin is once again really good and really believable. I buy into this dynamic, and I buy into them being a dynamic duo. Batman is constantly trying to scold his son, but the typical father warnings come off as idle, as Damian, despite his young age, is smart enough to see through his false threats. Their brief moments of bonding are really heartfelt in their simplicity, but effective regardless. You can tell that Bruce really cares for the kid, even if he is a stuck-up, stubborn little brat who knows way too much for his own good. And you can also tell that despite being raised as the heir to a throne and not a child at all, Damian is desperate to live a somewhat normal life outside his costume. He wants a family life. He wants to be seen in public. He's constantly fighting the basic instincts Ra's al Ghul embedded in him in an effort to respect his father's beliefs, even if he himself doesn't fully believe in them. He does this out of love. And you can tell when Bruce doubts his son in any context, it actually hurts Damian. But Damien also doesn't know how to express these emotions in a healthy manner. So instead, he just takes out his angst and anger on the nearest party. Bruce believes the kid doesn't have a heart due to his rough exterior. That couldn't be any further from the truth. Damien's jealousy of Nightwing should be a big indication of his love for his father. Because despite taking over his old mantle and replacing him as Robin, he didn't replace him in his father's heart. I really love the sparring scene between past and present Robins, but man, this one shot is a thing of brilliance. Dick Grayson is literally holding Damian Wayne up to his old Robin costume, the same way that Damian's father holds him up to the standards of that same Robin. And this whole time, Dick Grayson is reflected in the glass up against his former image. This is such a blink and you'll miss it moment, but it's absolutely beautiful and breathtaking. There's so much that's being expressed here in just a few frames. I love this shot. What's happening physically is reflecting what the characters are going through mentally. And in just a matter of moments, their dynamic is played out for the whole audience to see. And I gotta tell you, I'm starting to get really tired of these movies changing the preconceived notions I had about later Batman lore. I always hated Damian Wayne, and now, because of Son of Batman, and even more so because of this movie, I'm starting to learn to tolerate him, and maybe even understand him. And it's not because he's a good character. Like, I stand by my hatred of his overall presence, but the character itself is a breeding ground for interesting concepts and dynamics in the world around him. So yeah, I have to live with that. But now, the Court of Owls gimmick that I've always hated from its inception is starting to wear on me too. They're the movie's main antagonists. And I gotta say, I think this movie depicts them far better than any of the comics that I've read with them in it. Now granted, I'm willing to admit that because I'm not a fan of them, I haven't read a whole lot of comics with the Court in it. I kinda tried to deviate away from their appearances. But nonetheless, with everything that I've read or seen, this is my favorite version of that secret society. There's so much going on with them in this movie that I had to pause and rewind several times just so I could collect my thoughts on the matter. First and foremost, the most interesting has to be Talon. And that is not by coincidence, that is by design. There's so much to compare and contrast with this character and other characters within the continuity. Now, Talon has existed in the comics before, but it's more of a mantle than it is a man, at least to my knowledge. There have been several Talons over the years, and this one is just kind of a combination of most of them. So this version of the character was created in a way that you could juxtapose him with the other characters in the story. Like Damian, he was trained since birth how to acquire his unique set of skills. He was trained by family on the wrong side of the general moral compass. He was brought into a league at a very young age and told to follow orders no matter what the cost. He was groomed to be in a top spot and lead an army of underlings. But then on the other side, like Bruce Wayne, he was pursued by a league of crafty individuals and lured into it by the love of the leader. Not at all unlike how Ra's al Ghul tried to induct Batman into his League of Assassins, using his daughter Talia. I think Talon really stands out here. The story tells you just enough about this character. It allows him to keep his mystique, but it also allows viewers to get a sense of who he is, why he does what he does. Despite the mysterious aura surrounding this masked man with a distorted voice, he is still very much a human being underneath that mask. We see his humanity break through his conditioning in intervals, at times questioning and second-guessing the decisions the Council's made for him. He even fights against their orders and stands up for what he believes in. Despite being a trained warrior, the man is not a mindless mercenary. He's no drone even if they'd like for him to be. I would not mind seeing more of this specific Talon. Quite frankly, I think this is an overall upgrade to the character that I'm familiar with. While Bruce and Damian are having their monthly father and son spats, disagreeing on almost every aspect of crime fighting, the Court, or more specifically Talon, takes an interest in the sidekick, seeing him as the ideal protege, trying to get him to reach out and embrace the parts of himself that he's been trying to bury. I like that these two bond to some degree, and I can only imagine that Talon sees a lot of himself in the boy that he's mentoring. And then the movie makes it explicitly clear in this scene, but I actually wrote that line prior to watching this part of the movie. Talon is much more patient with the kid than the rest of the Court would ever be, eventually turning on his higher-ups when he's asked to kill Damian, completely turning against his code in favor of compassion. But that compassion only goes so far, apparently, as he then decides that he and his army of test tube Talons will take on the Batman themselves after they learn of his secret identity, thus using Damian as bait for the Bat. But when the two come to blows, Talon gets his woodsy owl-looking ass kicked by the father and son duo, who take his meddling in their relationship more than just a little bit personal. It's clear that because of the bond the two have created, and because of the similarities they share, and likewise lives that they lived, Talon projects onto the boy, and believes he too would be better off without his father. Ultimately, Talon is defeated and dies at his own hand. And the father and son share a much-needed hug. Though Damien is still determined to find his own way, and branches out to a monastery in the mountains to seek his own path. What an impactful ending to an already impactful movie. There's a few things I want to point out outside of my synopsis that I was very much in favor of. The Court of Owls drew Batman, and he envisions Batman as a mass murderer, leaving behind bodies of those he loves in his wake. But then when that Batman unmasks, it's not Bruce. It's an adult Damian Wayne, his own son. I really like that they included Damian's Batman suit from the comics. Again, it's a nice touch. And at first, I actually mistakenly believed that this was a reference to Bruce's Elseworlds father, Thomas Wayne. One more thing I liked, getting Kevin Conroy, the definitive Batman, to play Bruce's father in a flashback. There's not a lot to talk about here, but that was a good call. I like what you're doing there. This movie also gives us this amazing moment, which I have no words for, I just want you to see.
Now I'm only gonna say this once, you sons of bitches. Get the hell out of my cave!
But despite me piling on praise here, I do have some criticisms, critiques, and inquiries. So, let's get into those. Damien was born being taught to hold up honor, yet he openly gives his father his word and mentions his honor, but immediately discredits himself by doing the opposite and not holding up to either his father or grandfather's traditions. But to be fair, maybe this was the movie actually making subtle hints at the fact that neither one of their ways are his own. So, I mean, I don't know, maybe it's actually brilliant. I still have more, hold on. Young Bruce also taking out his vengeance on an innocent owl because he believed his family was killed by the Court of Owls? I don't know, that felt a little bit off and unsettling. And not the same way that the doll maker felt unsettling, that just felt wrong for the character. Don't tell me you wouldn't kill a murderous, rampaging, psychotic lunatic who has killed more people than he's let live, but then you gleefully shoot down a harmless, doe-eyed creature. I get it, Bruce is young and he's taking down what he feels the creature represents. This is symbolic of him going after the secret society that took his parents from him. I get it. I don't like it, but I get it. Also, later, Alfred's just out here slaying dudes in cold blood. I mean, sure, they're undead or whatever, but I still think that counts as living, considering they're alive. And also, Alfred doesn't know that. Alfred just comes in like, I'm gonna shoot first and let God ask all the questions. The Samantha heel turn was pretty obvious from the start for me. A new woman in Bruce's life when the Court of Owls show up? Yeah, obviously she's part of that team. But what was significantly more surprising was Talon turning on the court. And more so over, his love interest, also Samantha, kissing and then killing her in cold blood. So again, I don't know, I'm gonna break even on this particular part. We're gonna look past it. It is too much win here for it to be a loss. Overall, I give this movie my highest recommendation. I'm really glad I watched it myself because this is now one of my favorite Batman movies of all time. Again, this also goes down as yet another Batman movie that Batman isn't exactly the focal point, but he's had more of a role here than he's had in the previous Batman films in which I've made that same statement, so it's fine. Batman doesn't need to be the main character in a Batman movie, but he does have to be one of the main characters in a Batman movie, at least as far as I'm concerned. This movie is great, and I cannot recommend checking it out enough. I don't even think that my words have done it justice, so go and check it out for yourself.
If Batman doesn't return soon...
I know. We all need to take off the mask sometimes. To remind ourselves that we're people underneath.
Dick Grayson.
Another day, another Batman video I've never seen. And that's why today, we're here to talk about the next in this lineup, Batman Bad Blood. Now, for the most part, I've pretty much enjoyed all of this animated universe's Batman offerings. They just seem to get better and better with each new installment, and I'm really curious to see if this movie can follow up on that. And let me answer my own question immediately. Yeah, it does. This movie definitely follows up on the last one, not only in terms of quality, but even in terms of story threads. When Batman goes toe-to-toe with the Heretic, he's immediately reminded of his drug-induced nightmare of a twisted Damian Wayne from the future. And for good reason. Because the Heretic is in fact Damian Wayne. Kind of. He's basically an enhanced, age-advanced clone of Damian, who sort of embodies Batman's greatest fear, as well as Damian's own self-doubt. This dark Damian Wayne physically manifests what Damian buried deep inside, and what can only be described as a worst-case scenario for Batman. This version of the character was pretty much prophesized with the last two movies, and it's because of things like that within these movies that make me feel like this line of Batman films completed a narrative. Each completed their own narrative while still serving to create a greater narrative. This movie trilogy works so great because it seems like they had a working blueprint from the start. They had a vision and direction in mind before they put these together. And each movie seems like it's all been building up to this. Individually, these movies complete their own stories, but when watched side by side, they almost feel more like chapters in the same story. Unfortunately, the character is taken out of the equation pretty unceremoniously, which kind of diminishes the character as a whole, but on the other hand, it was a pretty shocking twist that ultimately adds to the careless and remorseless nature of Talia al Ghul, showing her as the ultimate unpredictable bad, lacking all compassion, empathy, and, well, humanity. It's a move that does help raise the stakes, and it keeps the viewer guessing. And it also proves to Damian just how expendable he is in his mother's eyes. For the first time ever, he understands how his mother sees him. And it's not as a son. It's as a henchman. Someone disposable. The love that he has for her is unrequited. Because all he is a League of Assassins project. One that she probably at this stage in life looks at as a failure. So there are some positives to come out of this. But it does feel like a little bit of a waste when the character only gets one meeting with Batman, a separate meeting with his younger self, and then he's slain. There was so much more that you could have done with this character. His arrival in this universe should drum up the same amount of discussion that was had when Damian arrived. When Damian entered everyone's lives, it changed dynamics. A new character had to factor into things. But here, Heretic isn't necessarily treated like a full-fledged character. Instead, he's more of a meaningless plot point, because there's so many different creative things that could have been done, and now they're all just missed opportunities. Maybe seeing an adult Damian turn to the dark side would make Batman reconsider and question their partnership, wonder what kind of influence he has on his son's life, and if this version of the character is really just predestined. Maybe he'd worry that the premonitions he once had were physically manifesting, and that Damian's betrayal was inevitable. Or hell, maybe you go the other route. Maybe Damian meets his older self and he too shares his father's fears. Maybe he doubts and questions himself until ultimately realizing that while the two are very much alike, they're not entirely the same. He'd come to realize that their differences make all the difference. Maybe you have old Damian trying to reach out and mentor young Damian. Maybe young Damian could defeat his older self. And their fight could be symbolic of the inner struggles that this character goes through. Who he is now facing who he used to be. I'm sorry, but there are just a lot of interesting routes this could have taken, and it just didn't. And that's a little disappointing. But to be fair, that is the first time that I'm disappointed by this series, so, they're doing good so far. And even with this potential negative, there is positive to come from it, so it's not an all-around L. It's like half an L. It's like a lowercase L. The movie really begins with a bang, but more accurately, a battle. It takes no time in delivering fast-paced action and fight scenes. And it also doesn't take its time in bringing in brand new characters to the mythos. Mid-battle, we're thrust into the plot, with Gotham City trying to survive in the wake of Batman's sudden absence. And I gotta say, watching a Batman project sans Batman just makes me feel like I'm watching a CW show. Except, better. Although truthfully, I've always been fond of these types of stories to some degree. I mean, don't get me wrong, I love Batman, but with the bat away, the family comes out to play. With Bruce gone, it gives so much more time and chance for other major characters to step it up, and here's no exception. We get to see a lot more of the characters fans know and love. I mean, what I really appreciate is that Nightwing plays a much bigger part here than he has previously in any of the other Batman films. With more importance comes more screen time, and with more screen time comes a more accurate portrayal of the character. And yeah, this is a pretty good performance. And due to this movie, I think it actually might be one of my new favorite Nightwing performances. I think Dick Grayson in this movie is really interesting, because he comes off as confident and cocky to a fault, yet serious and mature. It's like the guy knows that there's a time and place. He's still very much himself, but he's also fairly capable of donning the cape and cowl as well, even if I don't think that he should. But that's not a conversation for here, that's a conversation for an upcoming video. Bad Blood introduces the audience to two new members of the Bat family, that being Batwoman and Batwing. We don't get to know them intimately immediately. I mean, in Batwoman's case, she's brought in at the very start with very little explanation. The movie just goes,
"Look, it's me. I'm here. Deal with it. Let's move on."
As the plot develops, it's revealed that Batman kept a file on her, one that confirmed her identity as his cousin, Kate Kane. The file also reveals that Batman was unsure if he was going to take her in as a sidekick or take her down. In the case of Batwing, the movie kinda serves as his own origin story. This plotline doesn't take up too much screen time, but it's afforded just enough time to establish both the character and his motivations. Which is nice, because I always thought that Batwing was one of the most underrated characters in the Bat family. He's got some of the coolest looking gear in all of Gotham City, and it has advanced functions that would actually be useful. The only downside to the character is that he shares his superhero name with the name of Batman's jet.
Hey, Batwing. Need a ride in the Batwing?
Very funny.
I like both these characters, and I think that they were done justice here, but also done an injustice here. Both the characters were accurate portrayals, and they were performed very well, but I also feel like I could have used a little bit more time with each of them. It would have been nice to have them just a little bit more developed, and see them interact with the team a little bit more than they did. Regardless, I still enjoy it for what it was. Could have used more of these characters, even if I think they're both hypocrites. Batwoman's constantly talking about not following Bruce's rules and not doing things the Bat family way and that she does her own thing. It's like, dude, that's totally cool. You want to live by your own moral code? You do you. That makes sense to me. But don't strap on the Bat emblem and then put on your little pointy ears and then act like you're not just copying off of what they're doing. If you want to be a part of the team, you gotta be a team player. Like, I get that she's saying that she wants to do her own thing, but I don't know, don't you think it's a little bit too late to do that? There's no copyright on crime fighting, but there probably should be. You know, Bruce, maybe it's time to consult the lawyers. And Batwing is every bit as bad, because Batwing is out here pissed off at the Bat family, blaming them for what's happening to his father. He still creates a mech suit that resembles that of a bat? I don't know, it just seems contradictory. But other than that little rant, I like these characters very much. And they're not the only ones. Mad Hatter gets to show off his skills while also showcasing his strangeness. They even bring Renee Montoya into the fold for a little bit. She doesn't do a lot, but it's nice to see her. We even get to see that Alfred still ain't afraid to throw down. I will never tire of seeing this butler go around to fisticuffs, or just straight up acting like he's Arn Anderson and pulling the Glock out whenever he can. But what I really like about this movie is that it truly does feel like a team effort. There's a real emphasis put on this team assembling and how they work together in Batman's absence. I enjoy it, I just wish we saw more of it. I'm glad that we're establishing an extended Bat family, but I'd appreciate it even more if these characters were actually used in other DCAMU films. This was a one and done for them. And speaking of the Bat family, that brings me to one of the few things I'm not a fan of in this continuity. And it's that in this version of events, it seems like there's only ever been two Robins. The current Batman, Nightwing Dick Grayson, and Damian Wayne. That means no Jason Todd, no Tim Drake. They never existed. It feels like an off choice given that this is in fact an extended universe, and an appearance from them could have added to these stories and brought more star power and name recognition to them. These are beloved characters, their presence would probably be appreciated. But no, I guess not. No Reds, I guess. I don't know, I feel like they definitely could have figured out something for them to do. It's a bizarre choice to just willingly skip over two of the most famous sidekicks in all of Batman lore. To this movie's credit, it does juggle around a whole lot and manages to do it in a fluid manner. You have to remember that this movie is acting as a retelling of two separate comic book series, with two separate stories. It's introducing a brand new villain, two new heroes, bringing back the original Bat from the first two films, Talia, making Nightwing a believable Batman in his absence, establishing a new team with new dynamics, following up and completing arcs that started in the last two movies, while also attempting to make and tell its own story. And that's a whole lot to do in an hour and 12 minutes. And to its credit, it manages to pull it off with style. The one thing that's pretty interesting to me about this set of films, though, is that despite the movies being labeled as Batman movies, Batman is mostly secondary in them. He's like the Doug in The Hangover of this series. He's promoted and marketed as being there, but he's not really a main character. If anything, I would say that these movies are more Damian Wayne movies than anything else. And surprisingly, I really enjoy them. I think this is a good lesson to always give new things a chance, because these wound up being some of my all-time favorite Batman films ever made. Movies about my least favorite Batman character, mind you. The fight scenes are unsurprisingly pretty awesome. They're well thought out, entertaining sequences. And if you look away even for a moment, you're probably gonna miss something. I wouldn't say that this movie was as great as the ones that came before it, but it's pretty damn good in its own right. And it still feels like a solid sequel to the last installment. I'm somewhere in between like and love with this one, so I would definitely recommend checking it out for yourself if you haven't already. At the very least, it is absolutely worth the watch.
Name. Now. Hush. It's true, he calls himself Hush.
He said it! He said it! I needed a new persona. My true identity had to be kept hush-hush. Oh, that's why they call it that.
And I've talked a lot about the DC animated movie universe, and I've also talked a bit about the Hush storyline in comics. And that's why today, I'm here to talk about the Batman Hush adaptation that's linked to that line of films. So with that being said, let's just get right into it. So I want to start off by saying Batman Hush does feel a bit different from the other Batman films it's attached to. Unlike the others, this doesn't seem to add to the overall overarching narrative. Rather than a fluid continuation, this feels like a separate standalone adventure that just so happens to take place in that universe. Which I suppose makes sense because the last three movies felt like they started and completed a story. So I guess anything after that would just have to be its own thing. There's nothing wrong with that per se, I guess it was kind of inevitable. But given the fact that this was the way this set of films ended, it makes it stand out from the bunch that much more. I've already spoken on the channel before about my problems with the original Hush story, but in my opinion, the movie suffers from a lot of the same problems as the original story. Because this was originally a comic book series and the series wanted to stretch its story out for as long as possible, the arc took a lot of unnecessary turns along the way, further convoluting the plot and bringing in more established names and faces to play minor and major parts that, for the most part, didn't really serve that much of a purpose. Despite attempting to condense the story, they still kept a lot of the elements that muddled that story up to begin with. While I think the movie did benefit from some cutting down of the original source, there was still more that probably should have ended up on the chopping block as well. And I think this story also suffers a little bit from not being able to play certain events out as they were done in the original comic. Major plot points are sped through, and at times it feels like I'm watching the plot on fast forward. Batman's traumatic injury is just over and done with immediately. It makes you wonder why they would even bother to include that into the story. So as an adaptation, I think it leaves a little bit to be desired. The idea that Riddler, this mastermind, this super genius, was able to determine the true identity of the Caped Crusader due to a skinny dip in a Lazarus pit has really always been a creative goof. Had the Riddler figured out that Batman is Bruce Wayne on his own, that information gain would have felt earned and legitimized the Riddler as a worthy foe, as well as Batman's intellectual peer. But instead they went the ancient magic by chance route, and it doesn't really do anything for the character. It adds nothing to his credibility as a true foe to the Bat, and it doesn't make him feel like a legitimate threat to Batman physically or intellectually. Ultimately, he's just a guy who got lucky due to Deus Ex Machina. When the movie's trying to be a faithful adaptation, it sucks because it's a faithful adaptation. But then when the movie sways away from the original story, they're creating entirely separate issues. They change Hush's identity, which kinda works, to be fair. I always said that Thomas Elliot randomly being introduced into the lore was kind of a
dead giveaway. Dead giveaway.
Charles, thank you very much.
Dead giveaway.
New villain shows up in town around the same time that Bruce's best friend shows up in town. Gee, I wonder who this villain is. So I think turning it around and using the character as a total red herring is actually a pretty clever move. And they cut straight to the chase by revealing that the Riddler is in fact Hush. And I think that's good in some ways because, again, you're cutting straight to the point. Riddler was ultimately the end reveal behind Hush, except he was working with Hush. This movie just cut out the middleman and said, the Riddler is Hush. That's not a bad plot point, until you start thinking about it. You see, the end reveal is that this new villain is really just an old villain with a makeover. What even is the point? I also have a hard time believing that the Riddler would be able to not tell anyone who he is. I'm not doubting his abilities to put together such convoluted schemes. That's spot on. That makes sense for the character. I buy that. But the idea that the man who can't help but leave clues behind, tying his crime sprees back to himself, instead of just being stealthy and walking free, would be able to commit these crimes and not seek credit and attention for it? Yeah, I don't know. I don't think so. He needs to be acknowledged. He needs to be validated for his genius. I can't imagine him not wanting to sign his initials on his latest proverbial piece of art. And if the intent was to have the Riddler be seen as a campy doofus, it's both a pretty bad interpretation of that character, but also a pretty poor choice to feature him as the movie's main villain. What's even worse is that the Riddler's first and only appearance in the series doesn't showcase him as the Riddler, but instead makes him Hush. And because of this end reveal really lacks all sting. We don't even get to know him as a character before he's revealed to be the big bad. So it's almost like there's nothing to this revelation. The shock is that he's not Thomas Elliot like he is in the comics. And the only way you would know that is if you were familiar with that story. I kind of feel like this movie expects its audience to have an understanding or knowledge of the material going in, and that's not exactly the best way to tell a story. If you have to go into a movie knowing what the original comic book was like to understand the movie, then you have failed at making a movie. His reveal adds nothing. It's just kind of like, oh hey, there's that guy that we don't know but we've seen once. I just don't think playing as a pawn in his own overall scheme while he was shrouded in mystery would really be on the table for the Riddler. And in that same vein, this is the Joker's first appearance in this continuity. And it doesn't showcase him as the Clown Prince of Crime, but rather an innocent victim in Hush's scheme. And yeah, I get it. I know that was his place in the original story as well. But first off, that was a mistake. And secondly, maybe you didn't hear me, this is the Joker's only appearance in any of these Batman movies. What a way to portray Batman's greatest foe. In terms of Damian, his cameo was hilarious. But after seeing how well he was utilized and how important and integral he was to the previous movies, it's a bit jarring to see him take such a back seat. I guess it's probably because Damian wasn't around for the original story, so he didn't have a place set in it, but you could have done something to incorporate him in. I mean, we're talking about the character whose back these movies were made off of. Wait a second. Wait, did I just defend Damian Wayne? I don't even know who I am anymore. There's one thing I'm really starting to dislike with these movies, and it's the random time jumps to fast forward through character arcs and relationships. The last movie pretty much drops Batwoman into the plot as a previously established character, even though she was not. And this movie does the same thing with Catwoman. Having Batman met Catwoman and started a relationship with her sometime in between movies. And I understand why this is done, because these are all stories that were previously made before that they're trying to fit into their own universe. So they're trying to get the timeline to catch up to the narrative. But it sort of feels cheap when this happens, especially when it happens as often as it does. I'm not knocking it, I get it, I'm just stating that I'm not a fan of it. They sort of do the same thing with the big reveal of who Hush is as well. But because of these jumps to random points in the timeline, sometimes these movies will set something up, and ultimately it will never really pay off. Batgirl was revealed at the tail end of the last Batman movie, and in here she has absolutely nothing to do. The character literally shows up for one scene before being completely forgotten about by the plot. She was just there to have a tiff with Catwoman over Bruce's nearly dead body, and then just like that, poof, she's gone. She showed up that one time, and then she showed up again, and then she just stopped showing up. And that's it. That is all the time we're afforded with Batgirl. There's never really a reason given for her sudden disappearance anyway. The story just stopped caring about her. That's if it ever did care in the first place. But then again, some of the villains in this canon get that very same treatment. Here 1 minute, gone the next. I also find this movie to be a little bit of a weird follow-up to the last couple movies with the story. Mostly for reasons I've already expressed, but also because this is yet another Batman story where Bruce gets incapacitated. Look, I like these movies, but at times it feels like these movies don't necessarily like Batman. I joke. But on a serious note, The Dark Knight has never taken so many L's in all of his days. Now don't get me wrong, this movie isn't all bad. There are a lot of elements that I really like about it. Like the previous films, I think the dialogue and interactions are well written. I find all of these characters to be accurate portrayals and fairly entertaining. And even a lot of the new additions to this universe kinda work here. I like how they put the Batman and Catwoman romance together. They complement each other very well, just as you'd expect and hope to see in a relationship between these two. They're a good team both in and out of costume. And it's nice to see this Batman flirt with the idea of a normal life with the woman he loves. But unfortunately, it doesn't pan out that way for our dear Dark Knight. The movie does a great job of showing us why these two characters work together, but they also end up showing why they wouldn't actually work together. There's a lot of love there. These two are so alike, and yet it's their differences that make this an unworkable situation. There's definitely love there, but they have different moral compasses and codes, different goals and motivations. They're the same in so many ways, but what ends up splitting them apart is where they're different. And yet, despite this, when they part ways, you get the feeling that they're not saying goodbye, but instead saying goodbye for now. It's the sad ending that this story was always going to build up to. And speaking of Catwoman, she is undoubtedly the major highlight of this movie. I would say the last three movies were really the Talia trilogy, so it's kind of refreshing to get something different. And Catwoman, like the thief that she is, steals the spotlight. I find this performance to be pretty good. I think the character here comes off as more woman than cat. You get a feel for the persona, but this movie is really focused on showing you the person. I think she's more open, honest, and vulnerable than a lot of the other Catwoman performances. Mainly because the story takes place in a point where she's attempting to make things work with Bruce. She's putting her image aside to let her humanity take center stage. And in response, Bruce is also trying to shed his rough exterior. It's kinda sweet and also tragic watching these two desperately try to meet each other halfway and manage to get torn apart when they realize they couldn't. My biggest issue with this movie is that while there are things done well here, they're the same things that were done well, and I would even argue done better in the previous couple movies. Overall, I like this movie substantially less than I like the ones that came out before it, but I have a really hard time having the same appreciation for this, because I don't like it when it's following the original story, and I don't like it when it's trying to do its own thing. Despite that, I don't think it's terrible. There are definitely a lot of elements that work to this movie that I would say make it worth the watch, and I could very well see other Batman fans enjoying themselves. I'm just not one of them. I would recommend checking this movie out for yourself to make your own opinion, because I don't think the movie's necessarily bad by any means, it's just bad for me. So with all that being said, if you didn't think this video was bad, and you want to see me talk about the Justice League movies that are attached to this, let me know in the comment section below by leaving a comment saying,
Hush, hush.
I am vengeance. I am the night, and that was V Infuso. Just remember, if you're not tuning in, then you're missing out.
So, if you like the words that came out of his mouth hole, and you too would like to become a V-generate, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thanks for watching, nerds!
And if you're not joining the fun, you're in for one bad day. And you know what they say about having one bad day?
Catch him next time. Same bat time. Same bat channel.